There's a place on Earth where no government claims ownership, where no police patrol the streets, and where the rulebook of civilization simply doesn't apply. On this remote island, survival replaces law, and chaos becomes the only constant. What happens when society's invisible chains disappear completely? The island is called Sark, a tiny landmass in the English Channel between England and France, measuring just over 2 square miles. Until 2008, it was Europe's last feudal state, governed by medieval laws that hadn't changed in 4 centuries. When those laws finally collapsed, Sark entered a legal gray zone that transformed it into one of the strangest social experiments on the planet. This isn't a story about a distant, uninhabited rock. Real people live here, caught between the old world and the new, watching as their home became a testing ground for what happens when the framework of modern law stops working. Sark's unusual legal status began in 1565, when Elizabeth I granted the island to Helier de Carteret under feudal law. The deal was simple. He would defend the island from French pirates in exchange for absolute control. For over 400 years, this medieval system held firm. The ruling seigneur owned every inch of land, controlled who could live there, and passed laws without democratic input. The modern crisis began in 2008 when the European Court of Human Rights forced Sark to adopt democracy. The island held its first elections, created a chief pleas parliament, and appeared to join the 21st century. But the change was cosmetic. The old feudal families retained economic control, owning the hotels, the ferry company, and most viable businesses. By 2011, billionaire brothers David and Frederick Barclay, who owned a neighboring island, began buying up property in Sark. They acquired the island's hotels, shops, and utility companies, controlling roughly 1/3 of the economy. When the chief pleas tried to resist their influence, the Barclays closed their businesses overnight, putting 1/4 of the island's workforce out of jobs. The legal warfare escalated. The Barclays challenged Sark's new laws in court, arguing the island's democratic system was itself undemocratic because it reserved seats for landowners. They won. European judges agreed that Sark's constitution violated human rights. Suddenly, Sark's entire legal framework was invalid. Every law passed since 2008 existed in limbo. The crisis reached its peak between 2013 and 2015. Sark's government couldn't enforce regulations because any decision could be overturned in European courts. Building permits meant nothing. Environmental protections couldn't be enforced. Tax collection became voluntary in practice. The island entered what legal scholars called a jurisdictional vacuum, a place where law exists on paper but has no mechanism for enforcement. During this period, strange incidents began occurring. A businessman arrived claiming he'd bought historic cottages and began demolishing them without permits. When officials tried to stop him, he argued there was no legitimate authority to prevent him. He was technically correct. Another resident opened an unlicensed distillery, producing alcohol without health inspections or safety oversight. When confronted, he pointed to the legal chaos and asked, under whose authority was he being stopped? By 2016, population drain accelerated. Young families left for Jersey and Guernsey, where laws function normally. The island's year-round population dropped below 450 people, many of them elderly residents who'd lived there for decades and had nowhere else to go. Essential services began failing. The volunteer fire department couldn't recruit new members. The medical center operated with minimal supplies. The island's single police officer, technically a constable with unclear legal authority, described his job as suggestions backed by social pressure, not law. The primary evidence for Sark's legal collapse comes from court documents and government records. The European Court of Human Rights ruling in 2013 explicitly invalidated Sark's constitutional framework, stating it failed to meet democratic standards because property owners held guaranteed legislative seats. This wasn't interpretation. It was direct judicial nullification. Economic data confirms the Barclay brothers' control and its impact. Financial disclosures show they owned Sark Shipping Company, Sark Estate Management, and multiple hospitality properties by 2012. When they closed these businesses in October 2012, unemployment jumped from 2% to 23% within a month. These aren't disputed figures. Both sides acknowledged the shutdown happened. Journalists who visited during the crisis documented the practical breakdown. Reporters photographed demolished buildings with no enforcement actions. They interviewed residents who described operating businesses without licenses or safety inspections. Video evidence shows construction projects proceeding without oversight and commercial activity occurring outside any regulatory framework. However, not everything can be verified. Many incidents on Sark during this period went undocumented because there was no functioning system to record them. The island's newspaper stopped publishing in 2013 due to legal threats. Court records from Sark's own judicial system became unreliable because rulings could be instantly overturned on appeal. What we know represents only the visible surface of a deeper dysfunction. The Barkley brothers maintained they were attempting to modernize Sark, not destroy it. Their representatives argued the feudal system was genuinely oppressive, preventing economic development and trapping residents in medieval conditions. They claimed their business closures were legitimate responses to discriminatory legislation targeting their investments. From their perspective, they were fighting entrenched corruption, not creating chaos. Sark's traditional government told a different story. They portrayed the Barkleys as aggressive outsiders attempting to purchase political control by buying the island piece by piece. Chief Pleas members argued their resistance was defending local democracy against billionaire colonization. They pointed out that the Barkleys lived on nearby Breku, not Sark itself, and had no genuine connection to the community. Some legal experts question whether Sark truly became lawless. They argue that UK common law and European Union regulations continued to apply, creating a baseline of legal order even when local legislation failed. Professor Margaret Davies of Oxford's Centre for Socio-Legal Studies noted that jurisdictional ambiguity doesn't equal lawlessness. It creates confusion about which authority applies, not an absence of all authority. By this analysis, Sark was dysfunctional, not anarchic. Gaps in the record remain significant. We don't know how many incidents went unreported during the peak chaos years. We can't verify all claims of unlicensed activity because no regulatory body was keeping consistent records. The full extent of what happened in Sark between 2013 and 2016 may never be completely documented. For Sark's elderly residents, the legal collapse meant watching their retirement sanctuary dissolve. Pensioners who'd moved to the island for its peace and stability found themselves in a community where basic services couldn't be guaranteed. Medical evacuations became complicated because helicopter landing permits had unclear legal status. Insurance companies began refusing to cover properties on Sark, arguing the legal uncertainty made risk assessment impossible. Young families faced impossible choices. Schools continued operating, but parents worried about everything from building safety to teacher credentials, since certification enforcement had become murky. One mother described keeping her children home during a particularly chaotic period, afraid that if something happened, there would be no clear legal recourse. She left Sark in 2014. The island's workers experienced direct economic harm. When the Barkley businesses closed, hotel staff, shop workers, and utility employees lost income overnight. Because Sark's unemployment system was tied to the questioned legal framework, benefit payments became uncertain. Some families burned through savings waiting for resolution that took years. Several residents described falling into poverty while living on an island associated with wealthy tax exiles. The contrast was cruel. Legal scholars describe Sark as a living laboratory for understanding what law actually does. Dr. James Crawford, former International Court of Justice judge, explained it simply: law isn't just rules written on paper. It's the social machinery that makes those rules real. Sark showed what happens when the machinery breaks but the paper remains. Think of it like a car with an engine failure. The steering wheel and pedals still exist, but they don't connect to anything anymore. The island revealed how much of social order depends on legitimacy rather than force. Sark had no army, no significant police presence, no way to physically compel obedience. It relied entirely on people accepting that rules should be followed. When that acceptance dissolved, when every law could be challenged and potentially overturned, the entire system unraveled. This matters because most peaceful societies work the same way. We follow laws not because we're forced to, but because we believe we should. Sark demonstrated how fragile that belief can be. Economically, Sark became a case study in the weaponization of capital in microstates. Small jurisdictions with limited economic diversity are vulnerable to anyone wealthy enough to buy controlling interests. The Barclays weren't evil billionaires. They were rational actors using available tools to pursue their interests. The lesson isn't about individual villains. It's about structural vulnerability. Any tiny community with a single economic pressure point can be captured by concentrated wealth. Here's where we are. Sark's medieval legal system collapsed. European courts invalidated its replacement, and for several years the island functioned in a strange gray zone where laws existed but couldn't reliably be enforced. We know the economic disruption was real and measurable. We know people left and communities fractured. What we don't know is every incident that occurred during those chaotic years, because the systems that would document them weren't working. The question now becomes, did Sark find a way forward? Or is it still trapped in legal limbo? Sark has slowly rebuilt a functional legal framework, though problems remain. By 2017, the island adopted a revised constitution that passed European scrutiny, restoring basic legal authority. The chief pleas regained the ability to pass enforceable laws, and government services resumed normal operation. This has happened and continues. However, the underlying vulnerabilities haven't been resolved. Sark's population continues declining, dropping below 400 permanent residents by 2024. The Barclay brothers sold most of their Sark holdings after Frederick Barclay's death in 2022, but the island remains economically fragile. A different wealthy buyer could recreate similar pressure. The structural risk exists, though active exploitation isn't currently occurring. The broader precedent worries legal experts. Dozens of microstates and territories exist in similar positions. Small populations, limited economic diversity, vulnerable to external pressure. Sark proved these places can enter legal crisis quickly if challenged by determined actors with resources. Whether other jurisdictions learn from Sark's experience or repeat its mistakes remains uncertain. Climate change may create new pressures. Rising seas threaten Sark's limited infrastructure, and the island lacks resources for significant adaptation. If erosion makes parts of Sark uninhabitable, the remaining population may drop below the threshold needed to maintain government services. At that point, legal authority could dissolve not through court battles but through simple depopulation. This is speculative but based on concrete environmental trends. Sark's story isn't about one island's problems. It's about the invisible architecture that makes civilization possible, and how quickly that architecture can fail when its foundations are questioned. The island survived its crisis, but the scars remain, and the lessons apply far beyond the English Channel. If this story fascinated you, watch our next investigation. The town that accidentally became illegal. It explores another community that fell through jurisdictional cracks, with even stranger consequences.